Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Freely Nourished, the podcast that teaches you to break the cycle of dieting and nourish your body well. My name is Erin. I am your host and registered dietitian, owner of New You Nutrition Counseling, and so much more. And today I have a wonderful treat for you. I'm going to be breaking down one of the diets I actually probably get the most questions about, and that is intermittent fasting. So buckle up. My intention is not necessarily to sway you in one direction or the other. It is much more just to provide you with that factual evidence base and essentially just get into the science and tell you what it says. Whether or not intermittent fasting is right for you, your circumstances is going to be between you, your doctor, and your dietitian. If you want more personalized guidance, of course, I am happy to provide that for you. You can book a discovery call or a one-on-one appointment with me. All of those options are available via my website, which I will link below. But if you're just curious about intermittent fasting, you've heard a lot about it, and you just kind of want to know from a more grounded kind of summary standpoint what the science actually says about it, then this is for you. So without further ado, I'll kind of launch into it. And I want to say that, sometimes I like doing things like this because it forces me to re-up on the research. So I would say the last time I took a real deep dive into intermittent fasting was probably, I would say 2019, 2020 was kind of when it first kind of really came to the scene. Fortunately, unfortunately, not much in the way of what we know has changed, but it's always good to kind of get some updated resources and things like that. So if you are unfamiliar, intermittent fasting is kind of this new fad diet with lots of health claims behind it. So what intermittent fasting actually is it refers to periods of energy restriction. Or known as fasting, and then periods of eating not really with any type of restriction. So we call that ad libitum in the literature. If you kind of see it referenced as that basically just means kind of eating what you want, how much of it you want, etc. during these periods of feeding, and then having these kind of time restricted periods of what's called fasting, where you're basically not eating anything at all. Obviously, you're probably consuming water and things like that, but the idea is that you're not taking in any calories during those fasting periods. A lot of the research kind of behind intermittent fasting of kind of why people looked into this in the first place is really, when you think about humans kind of in our hunter-gatherer days. So I say this all the time on podcasts and on my social media and things like that, but humans we did not evolve with a steady food source, right? For most of human existence, we didn't have a consistent source of food. There were periods maybe where we did, but then there were periods where we didn't. So we have kind of like this feast and famine type of dynamic going on. And a lot of how our human metabolism now functions is the result of that. It is kind of maximizing the use of resources when they are available and then conserving those resources when they are not. So this idea of having food, and of course, there's the issue of food insecurity, right? I'm not by any means glossing over that, but for the sake of kind of, the majority of how humans live now, food access, at least to some sort of calories, is not necessarily a problem. It's a problem for some people, and it's actually a problem for probably more people than especially us as Americans like to think about or even realize. But this idea of kind of abundance of food readily available at all times, is relatively new in human evolution, like within the last 100 years. And if you think about humans who have been around for 4 or 5 millennia, that's a relatively new development. And our metabolisms have not adapted to having a steady food source just yet. So that's kind of why people are looking into intermittent fasting. The main question being, do humans function better? Do our metabolisms function better? Are we healthier, et cetera? Following kind of what we evolved to experience. And, I will say kind of right out, the short answer is we don't know yet. But I will get you into kind of what the science actually does say. I also want to be really clear, and this is something that drives me nuts, that a lot of the health claims associated with intermittent fasting do not accurately represent the data that we have at present. So I will go on a limb and say at least 75% of the studies that have been done on intermittent fasting have been done in a preclinical realm or of one sort or another. Now, by that, I mean that they were not done on humans. They were done in either cells, they were done in animal models, particularly rodents, primarily rodents. There's some non-human primates, so like monkeys and things like that, studies, but very, very little data on how intermittent fasting actually affects humans. So a lot of the health claims that we see are really misrepresentations of the research that's out there. A lot of this research does represent effects that we're seeing in animal studies. But kind of a key caveat to that is that when you do animal studies, you're controlling for a lot more than just the diet. So, you have your animals who are following kind of your experimental protocol, which is maybe your fasting protocol. And then you have animals that are kind of freely fed, but they're all living in the same type of housing, probably in the same room. They get the same amount of daylight, same amount of water, same amount of like human interaction or like social exposure, those kinds of things. When we do studies in human, all of that goes out the window because people just live different lives. And the data that we'll talk about kind of reflects that. But I just want you to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So intermittent fasting at its core is just periods of fasting followed by periods of free feeding or ad libitum feeding. There are various different types of regimens to do that. So the most popular in terms of what people actually practice is something called time restricted eating. And what that means is you are eating for certain hours, you're eating every day, but you're eating only during certain hours. So that's where we get into regimens like 16-8, 18-6, 24, 12 and 12, things like that. So that's time restricted eating, where like you're basically eating probably roughly the same amount of calories every day, but you're eating them during like a certain eating window. Ironically enough, that really hasn't been studied much at all. Definitely not in humans. Ironically enough, that's actually probably the least studied paradigm, certainly in humans, but honestly, probably overall. What is far and away more studied is what we call either like alternate day fasting or intermittent energy restriction. So that can actually look two different ways. One is that you have 24 hours of free feeding so that, you're able to eat whatever you want in 24 hours. And then the next day, it's usually not a complete fast. It's usually you're eating somewhere between like 200 to 500 calories, but something that is kind of less than a quarter of your your daily intake. So if you need 2,000 calories per day, you're eating something below 500 calories. So something that's less than 25% on those alternate days. So that's alternate day fasting. It's just you fast one day, and by fast, they mean, 500 calories. And then the next day you eat basically whatever you want. That's probably the most studied. And then there's kind of this newer onslaught of what they call intermittent energy restriction, which is where you don't necessarily do alternate days, but it's more of 2 days a week. You follow that 25% calorie intake. And then on the other days you eat kind of freely. So that one's kind of a little bit newer. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Some studies do that where like those 2 days, typically the 2 days are not consecutive days. So you just pick 2 days a week where you're not eating a whole lot, but they're always kind of in between them. There's days where you're eating rather freely. That one's a little bit newer. The alternate day fast is probably the one that's been studied the most. And to that end, I think it's important to note kind of the practicality of this, right? And what populations this has been studied in as well. So again, to kind of walk you through the backstory, this whole idea came about thinking, okay, well, humans used to go through periods of feast and famine. So there was fasting involved. So maybe we function better, or maybe our metabolisms are just kind of better wired to function that way. And honestly, in the animal models, it does show a lot of benefits. The animals that are kind of fasted on that on the alternate day fasting, they tend to do a lot better. They have really, it's kind of hard to, when we think about animal models, the way that diseases develop is very different. Rats don't just like spontaneously develop diabetes the way that humans do. So we have to use various genetic models, which of course is always going to kind of throw another variable in there. So again, when we're looking at some of this data, we kind of have to take it with a grain of salt because it's in rodents, it's not in humans. The conditions are probably more tightly controlled in some ways, but also we're also like falsely inducing a disease state that does not naturally occur in that animal. So I think, kind of when you look at some of these studies, be really careful that you're paying attention to what you're looking at. That said, in the models of various disease states, so obesity, diabetes, heart disease, et cetera, the rats do show improvement. The rats show, that the alternate day fasting helps them basically survive those diseases that we're forcing upon them better. And to an extent, some of that translates into humans as well. I think probably the two best studied disease states in humans are diabetes and overweight or obesity. I would make the argument that overweight and obesity is not a disease state. However, if one of your outcome measures is weight loss, that this intermittent fasting regimen does produce weight loss. And I found a really nice review. It was by Harris et al. It is in, let's see, it was done at the Briggs Institute. So I will gladly link all of my references that I use to kind of compose this, so you guys can read the studies yourselves. But basically their meta-analysis showed that in overweight and type 2 diabetic populations, the alternate day fasting, again, that's really important. The alternate day fasting did show reduction in insulin levels, in fasting glucose, and to an extent in some lipid profiles, although that data was a little bit muddy according to this study. It was a review that was written in 2018. So I think it's kind of, again, important to notice that. I will say that a lot of the studies that they were reviewed were not true randomized controlled trials, and they were also had very small population numbers. So I will say all of this data was done in humans. I will say that. But when we think about kind of the statistical power and really what conclusions we can draw from various types of studies, if it's not randomized and controlled, if there's not a control group, it's kind of hard to say, well, like you saw an improvement in the same person over time, but would you have seen an improvement in somebody who wasn't following that diet regimen over the same period of time? You can't really say that. I will also say that, people were overweight or obese, but sorry, I felt a tickle coming on. And sometimes they had type 2 diabetes, but a lot of times people who had like multiple other health conditions, which is realistically how most people function, were excluded from the study. So like they could have type 2 diabetes, but they couldn't have type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, for example. So you kind of factor in things like that. Well, like, does that really apply to the large majority of the population? But that said, I mean, they found, they only sampled really a total of 6 studies. So there's only a total of 6 studies. And I think at most the studies, I'm looking through here. I think at most the studies I think the biggest one had 100 participants and the others were significantly smaller. So just, again, kind of keeping in mind, this isn't a huge clinical trial with, nice controls and things like that. It's a very small study done by, a group of people. And then I will say probably the biggest downfall in all of this is that none of these studies extended beyond 12 months. And in fact, only one of them went to 12 months. The others all stopped at 3 months. So even though there were some benefits they saw, decreases in weight. They saw decreases in circulating insulin, and they also saw a decrease in waist circumference. So that's just kind of the measure around your belly. But again, we only know that that happens after 3 months. If these people were to continue after 3 months, we don't know if that would change. I will say that there were several that looked at the alternate day fasting compared to the time restricted. So basically, is there a difference between alternate day fasting, where you are basically eating very few calories on one day, versus on and then you eat kind of freely the other days, or if you eat very few calories on 2 days and then eat, normal calories the rest of the days, versus kind of having these windows of like, I don't know, 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. Basically, they saw that there was no difference in lipoprotein, so no difference in cholesterol, triglycerides, things like that. But there was no difference in weight. But the people who did the alternate day fasting that's where those glucose markers looked a little bit better, was with the alternate day fast. In 2019, a group, Stedovic et al., did another study kind of looking at metabolic markers specifically. And they found, they basically kind of tease apart, okay, well, why is this, right? Because they saw that, from the kind of first review, we know that, okay, people, when we restrict calories, excuse me, when we restrict calories, whether it is in a continuous manner with just kind of time restricted eating, where you're eating kind of at the same time every day, or if you restrict calories by, not eating for 2 days out of the week and then eating normally for the other 5, we saw about the same amount of weight loss. But the people who did this alternate day fasting, they saw improvements in some of those metabolic markers, such as their insulin and glucose. So what we want to figure out is like, okay, we can't say that the weight loss is what's causing that, because the people in the other group lost the same amount of weight, but they didn't have the same metabolic benefits. So what is it about this alternate day fast that potentially provides those benefits? So they did a very small study. I mean, 30 people. These were all healthy individuals too. I want to make it make it clear that, these are people who did not have any variations in their metabolic markers, but we're kind of just looking to see, okay, well, what happens if we subject them to this? It did not have a control group either. It was just kind of running these people through the diet and seeing what happens. And they saw, similar things. So alternate day fast, they saw the same thing: lower LDL cholesterol, which is the bad kind, lower triglycerides. And they weren't measuring weight loss because these were people of like a healthy weight. But they also saw an increase in ketone production, which was kind of a clue that maybe this induced state of ketosis is what's causing this. Which is plausible, right? Because, your body does go into ketosis theoretically after like 36 hours. So it could be that was kind of what was driving at it. So that was kind of a clue. And then we have let's see. So then we have kind of another really nice kind of review that pops up from the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very well-respected very well-respected journal, detailing kind of just a review of similar type studies. And basically what we found from that is kind of more of the same, is that the alternate day fast seems to be more beneficial for metabolic markers. So things like triglycerides, cholesterol, blood pressure is kind of one of those that's like kind of really blurry in the middle. Weight loss, like I said, seems to be the same between the intermittent, like time restricted fasting versus alternate day fasting. But for those real true like improvements to things like cardiovascular health, diabetes management, and presumably things like longevity, cancer, etc., those things seem to be only prevalent when you see the alternate day fast. But again, all these studies are just short term. So we really don't know how this presents itself through a lifespan of years of doing it. And then, of course, they're also kind of summarize that there's several other studies that have rolled out showing that ketones are a part of this. But what does that mean in terms of the mechanism? I think the jury's still out, honestly. From what I have gathered, we truly do not know how this tends to kind of fluctuate in the scientific community. Is kind of, okay, now we have a mechanism, but in humans, we're kind of limited in terms of what we can actually manipulate in a trial. So like I said, some of these studies don't have control groups because like it may not have been an option, right? Some of the studies, we can't just like starve people, right? Or give them to tell them that, they can't opt out of, so like adherence to the diet and things like that may be somewhat limited. So there's only so much that we can ethically do to humans. So a lot of times what we will do is kind of, okay, we think these ketones are now somehow involved. Let's go back to the preclinical stage and look at, in a cellular level, how might that affect things, and then scale up into like, in a full body, like rodent, how would that affect things? And then once we think we have clearer answers, then we kind of come back to humans and say, okay, we think these ketones are related. Can we manipulate ketones or things like that to duplicate their response? Things of that nature. So kind of, right now, all we know is that alternate day fast seems to have more health benefits than the time restricted eating. The time restricted eating really doesn't have any benefit beyond general calorie restriction. And basically there's lots of reviews that show, even with weight loss being the main outcome goal, that there's really no difference between like time restricted eating, so like restricting when you eat, versus just following a simple calorie deficit. The weight loss is about the same. All of the metabolic markers are about the same. So there's really no additional benefit to following a time restricted eating pattern. Even if weight loss is your goal, beyond just following a calorie deficit. If you are looking for kind of, diabetes management, age and longevity is implicated in there, cancer treatment, things like that, there's some evidence to suggest that this alternate day fast, whether it is like a 36-hour fast followed by a 12-hour feed, so like a true alternating days, or if it is a you pick 2 days out of your weekend and you're eating less, less than 25%, and then you eat normally the rest of the days. Those seem to have the most robust benefits. But that said, a lot of these trials, they're done in healthy individuals. So it's kind of like we're waffling, like, yes, it lowered, say, fasting insulin, for example. It lowered fasting insulin, but the person was in the normal range of fasting insulin the entire time. So is that significant is kind of my question. Is that clinically meaningful? Does that translate to a population where maybe fasting insulin is not normal? And that's a question we don't have the answer to yet, because these results have not been duplicated in patients with heart disease or with diabetes, kind of being the two main ones. Certainly nothing like, cancer, liver disease, et cetera. So I think it's kind of the question then remains, well, does this mean anything? Right? It's a clue, but what do we really know? Still not a whole lot, if that makes sense. So kind of, my take home from it. And I will say too, I've seen lots of, ketone supplements and things like that. Based off of this research, right? That's where a lot of this comes from, and where people are saying, oh, ketones are beneficial for blah, blah, blah. We don't have the scientific data, and it's right here, right? Like all of these studies that are publishing these promising results will be the first to tell you, like, we don't have any reason to believe that those ketones are going to improve this, that, or the other. We just, like, this is what we know. What we know is that when we don't feed people for intermittent periods of time, their insulin levels drop, their glucose control improves, things like that. But what we don't know is, and it doesn't seem that the fasting has anything to do with weight loss or the benefits have anything to do with weight loss, because we see weight loss from other things without seeing those metabolic benefits. But we don't have a reason to believe that ketones in and of themselves are beneficial. What we do know is that they're somehow part of this equation. They may be the driving part, but they also may be the resultant part. So we truly don't know. We have no reason to believe that taking any type of ketone supplement is beneficial. And more importantly, the supplements that call themselves ketones really aren't. You cannot get ketones other than having your body produce them. So what ketones are is your body breaking down fat into a molecule other than a triglyceride. So normally your body breaks down fat into triglycerides that are then used by your cells, but it can also convert those triglycerides to a ketone body. It's basically an extra metabolic step that those then ketones can function in ways more similar to carbohydrates, particularly for brain function in the absence of carbohydrates or glucose. To that end, your body has to make them. The ketone drinks and things like that, like they're basically just like sugar alcohols that your body is not going to convert to anything. The only way to truly produce ketones is to not eat for 36 hours or more. That is the only way you're ever going to get ketones in your body. And is that appropriate for all people? No, right? There are lots of people for whom that would actually be very, very dangerous in health. And that's why a lot of this research is done in healthy adults, because there's a huge risk associated with taking people who are not healthy and then underfeeding them. And there's just so much still that we don't know, that we can't take that risk with those people because they're already vulnerable. So kind of my take home from all of this is, frankly, don't waste your time on the time restricted eating. I don't think it provides any benefit to you. If your goal is weight loss, my goal for you, or my recommendation to you, is still going to be a moderate calorie deficit. So that's going to be anywhere from like 200 to 500 calories from your maintenance goal. And I just don't see any benefit to the time restricted eating. If that is the way that is easiest for you to create that calorie deficit, then that is okay. So long as you don't have any other health conditions or anything like that would be problematic for you, that would cause damage. For example, I know lots of people who would work out at 6 o'clock in the morning and, be really hard on their body and then not feed it until 12. In my opinion, that's increasing oxidative stress, which is damaging your body. I think those people are far better served to eat around their workout, and kind of just focus on an overall calorie deficit. And that is generally reflected in how those people feel when I tell them to stop doing that. That said, if you're somebody who doesn't work, if you wake up, you're not particularly a breakfast person, you generally don't eat until 11 o'clock or later anyway, your workout's not until the afternoon. I think that it can be appropriate for some people, but I just don't see a benefit in that alone. What the general accepted consensus is at this point is that following something like a 16-hour fast plus an 8-hour eating window generally doesn't do anything for you other than help you create a calorie deficit. So I don't see any advantage to that. The alternate day fasting, while there is definitely some strong evidence that it could be beneficial to some people, there's a lot more that we don't know than we do. So definitely don't waste your time and money on ketones or supplements claiming to be ketones, because like I said, your body has to create ketones. And the only way to do that is to fast for at least 36 hours. And even that's not long enough for some people. So, no supplement that you put in your body is actually going to help guarantee an increase in ketone production. And then, the alternate day fasting will, but again, that comes with a lot of consequences and a lot of caveats. So, I would just urge you to be very, very careful. Even if you are healthy, it still may not work great for your body. So, and again, even on those fasting days, we're still eating at least 500 calories. So I'm never, certainly not without more evidence, am I ever going to advocate for this for anybody. But that said, you are all presumably adults with full body autonomy. So if you want to try it, you can. Just kind of know that honestly, the evidence is thin. There's just not a whole lot there. There's a lot of factors that go into it that we don't know still. And then kind of lastly, what I will say is probably the most recent application of all of this has been actually in cancer patients. There is and I would say, honestly, there's some strong evidence to suggest, which sounds super backwards, to that fasting regimens in conjunction with in conjunction with chemo, just keto rolls off the tongue. So fasting regimens in conjunction with chemotherapy can sometimes be beneficial. That said, I would not do that without the guidance of both your oncologist and your dietitian. There are a lot of very strict parameters in terms of really, one, how to get the most benefit out of that. So the timing is really crucial. And then also, it also varies very much. The effectiveness or the benefits varies depending on the health status and the nutrition status of the patient. So that would mean we want to monitor certain labs, and your weight and things like that. So definitely that's something to discuss with your oncologist if you do find yourself in that position. But I would, be very, very cautious. Definitely don't try to do it on your own. It's something that you want to do under very tight medical supervision. So yeah, I think that is pretty well the culmination of what I've got for you guys. Certainly not the worst diet I've ever heard out there, but also not the best. Lots to tease apart. If you are curious about kind of whether or not this is for you, like I said in the beginning, you're more than welcome to book a discovery call with me. That's available through my website, which is just newunutrition.com. And we can kind of talk about what your goals are, whether or not, nutrition counseling, whether or not that involves intermittent fasting is right for you, things like that. And then, of course, if you are curious about other topics, I would love to hear what information you guys are wanting, what kinds of diets are out there. It's evolving all the time, but I always am going to bring you what the evidence actually says. So that said, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you at our next episode. Have a good one.